sitting there. So I pretty much have to have a pretty good idea what's going on in the world all the time. So I apologize though. Tonight I had to make some cards for myself because I'm going to cover a lot of topics. And you know, one thing I wanted to say is some of you all are getting to be as old as me. You know, they say when you get older how time flies. I missed this summer. I don't know, did anybody see it? Did it ever get warm enough? Something happened. I'm sorry, I know I missed it. When I first got hired by, I got hired by Fox back in 2002, and before I was on with Fox, as Ron was mentioning, I was on a whole bunch of other channels, and CNN actually interviewed me to hire me, but they determined I was too fair and balanced. And indeed, for some of our hardcore Republican friends, you're going to be angry with me tonight because I am fair and balanced. I was very critical of a number of things during the Bush administration, and I'm equally critical of a number of things during the Obama administration. Because I focus on the topic or the subject or the issue. I don't focus on the politics. Ron said something about my background. Let me tell you that my life background has been, excepting for combat in Vietnam, has been clandestine operations, clandestine activities overseas until very recently. You know me as a Fox guy. The fact is I've been to Iraq 13 times since U.S. forces left. My life has been clandestine operations and activities in support of intelligence activities or special operations activities. So when I go on television or I hear an issue going on that is anywhere in that realm there, I'm really speaking, I think, with authority. I can't always go on and say I know what they're talking about. Can't give all the details, but I generally have a pretty good feeling what's happened. And in that context, I was very critical of the Bush administration, and you'll hear some of that from me tonight. And I'm critical of the Obama administration, certainly more so. And I think for good reasons. Joe said, when he asked me to come, he said, a lot of people here in Myrtle, in fact, a lot of people everywhere, are worried about the future. And I get that. I just moved to Mount Airy. My wife lives in Mount Airy, North Carolina, Mayberry. I just moved there, and the mayor asked me, you know, maybe a year ago when I was down there speaking, she said, hey, Colonel, do we need to be worried here in Mount Airy? I said, no, Madam Mayor, you don't need to be worried. And I'll tell everybody why. Back in '95, when the Murrah building went down in Oklahoma City, I think it was '95, I'd already done a piece with Mike Wallace in Beirut. Mike Wallace chases me down. I'm out in California. The bombing was on a Wednesday, and he called me out. I was out in Oregon. He called me and he said, Bill, I want you here this Sunday. We're going to do our first ever live 60 minutes. We want to talk about this. I know you know all about Middle Eastern terrorism, and that's what we're going to have on the show. I said, Mike, it wasn't Middle Eastern terrorists. He said, what do you mean? I said, Mike, nobody in the Middle East has ever heard of Oklahoma City. It's true. It wasn't Middle Eastern terrorism. So I would tell you all, for whatever it's worth, nobody in the Middle East has ever heard of Myrtle Beach. Just like nobody's ever heard of Mount Airy. So from that context, you're pretty safe. Now, if you want to move to Washington, D.C. or New York, I might have a different message. But things are going to happen to all of us at some point in the future, I think, just for the most people. All the bad things I'm going to talk about tonight. All the dangerous things, all the scary things, just realize that I put that in the greater context of our country, not in the context of what might happen to you. Now, I've spent most of my career involved in the Middle East, going back primarily 1983, the bombing of the U.S. Embassy, and I became part of a clandestine entity in the Pentagon, and that entity still exists to this day. It's the most classified counterterrorist organization there is in the Pentagon. There's sometimes peripheral mentions of it. I was one of the founding members, in fact. It's grown, it's changed its mission since I was there, but going back to '83 up to a year ago, I was still in and out of the Middle East on a regular basis. So I understand the Middle East, I know what's going on, I know the bad guys, I know the good guys, I know the players. And I always like to tell people I've spent a lot of time with Muslims. And I spent a lot of time with Muslims who loved America just as much as we do. And a lot of time with Muslims who would have died protecting me, giving their lives protecting me, even though I wasn't a Muslim. So I always caution people, don't paint the picture that all Muslims are bad. We don't believe in things exactly the way they do, they do, and we do. One of the closest guys I was with, my wife knows him, said his prayers 3 times a day. We'd take a break, he'd get down on his rug and he would pray, but I guarantee you, there's no question, that guy would have taken a bullet for me in a heartbeat. And all the work I did with the Iraqi Special Operations Forces the last few years, those guys, most of them were trained right here in the United States by U.S. Special Operations Forces. Fought side by side in Iraq with U.S. Special Operations Forces. Ran the same kinds of missions. You know, you see that bin Laden raid, how we went in and did this thing. That was a standard tactic, a standard type raid in Iraq. Thousands of them run. Every night there were raids exactly like the bin Laden raid being run in Iraq. And Afghanistan right now, still being run. So those are being run with Muslim Afghanis or Muslim Iraqis who were there. Many of them died, killed side by side with their Americans. And I like to paint that picture because it's easy to broad brush and say all Muslims are bad. They're not. They're not. Many of them have the same heart and values. They love their families like we do. They love freedom. They love what America represents. They'd love to come live in America. And we need to keep that in mind when we look at them. Now, the Middle East. Why is the Middle East so darn important to all of us? Well, oil, it's a good start. We wish it weren't quite so, but it is so. Oil is important to us. The Suez Canal, pretty darn important for trade. If the Suez were shut down, and I'll talk about Egypt in a little while, if the Suez were shut down, the prices on a lot of things would go through the roof, without a doubt. Trade, of course, just trade in general, not just the Suez Canal, but I'll tell you another reason they're important, the atom bomb. Iran's going to have that nuclear weapon. We need to pay attention to what's going on in the Middle East because of the Iranians and that nuclear weapon, which frankly the Bush administration didn't do a lot better than this administration in forestalling the fact that they're going to build that bomb. And Israel. Israel's the number one reason. Everybody doesn't support Israel, I guarantee you I do. I've been there a few times. I respect them for the democracy that they are. You don't realize how small Israel is until you're there. And you can almost see the Arab countries on every border. And again, I'll go back to Egypt in a little while later and maybe speak a little bit about Jordan. Certainly as they look to the north and they see Lebanon and Hezbollah and Syria, they've got a lot to be concerned about all the time. But the Israelis represent the same values we do, a true democracy. Now I'm going to move around the Middle East a lot while I talk here, and I'll try not to get too disjoint, and I'll leave a lot of places out, but it's still worthwhile talking about some of the key players. And I'll start with Iran for no particular reason except the fact that I just mentioned them, the makers of a nuclear weapon. Go back to 1979 when the Shah was overthrown and Ayatollah Khomeini came in. From that time until this time, Iran has been our #1 enemy. Perhaps around the world. We can argue a little bit now and then about Russia. We can argue about China's long-term goals and objectives. But the fact of the matter is, Iran is our #1 enemy. And the Iranians, and I'll propose we go to war with them, the Iranians have a lot of resistance elements inside Iran, fighting against the mullahs and the regime all the time. And probably the most notable of them is a group called the MEK. And I want to talk about the MEK just for a minute to give a sensing of who these kinds of people were. The MEK had a military arm, but they're more of a political entity. They operate out of a political entity in Paris. And the mullahs are scared to death of them. They always have been. The MEK represents a large number of people inside Iran who are vehemently opposed to the administration, to the mullahs, to the Sharia law, to the nature of the oppression that they have. And the government over there, the mullahs, the ayatollahs, have been after the MEK forever. After them forever. So during the Clinton administration, as the MEK continued to be pretty active, during the Clinton administration, the Iranians came to President Clinton and said, if you will put the MEK on the terror watch list, the designated terrorist organization, we'll quit carrying out some of the terrorist actions that we're doing. Clinton said, great, all right, let's do it. So the MEK, who frankly, again, represents democracy and our values, they go on the terror watch list. And they stay there. And the MEK actually started fighting against the Iranians with the help of Saddam, which ended up being a problem for them. But they were supporting our values and fighting the Iranians. Well, when we invaded Iraq, the MEK as an entity was there. First thing the Iranians wanted us to do was wipe them out. And President Bush's White House said, Yeah, that sounds fair. They're up there on the terror list. They must be bad guys. And when General Horry County in the 4th Infantry Division went out to the camp that they were at, Camp Ashraf, to get them to surrender all their weapons, turn themselves over and become prisoners, they wouldn't turn their weapons over. In fact, he was astounded when he got there and found out that the commander of the MEK was a woman, educated in the United States. But half the senior officers there were women who've been trained and educated in America, who were fighting against the Ayatollahs, the regime. And so American policy kind of turned around and said, oh, well, we do want to take a look at these people. Maybe they are our friends. Maybe they're not what the State Department has said, although they stayed on the terror watch list. And then the Bush administration said, well, look, maybe we can make a deal here with Iran. Maybe we'll keep the MEK inside this camp if Iran will promise, and we'll keep them on the terror watch list, if Iran will promise to stop supporting bad guys inside of Iraq and stop supporting terrorism around the world. Iran said, absolutely. You leave them on the watch list, darn right. We'll quit doing all that stuff. Well, they didn't. We left them on that watch list. Just recently, by court decision, they were taken off the watch list. They never should have been on it in the first place. The members of the MEK who were sitting at Camp Ashraf, remind you, the Bush administration was party to all this, ended up being attacked on a regular basis by Iranians crossing the border, killing residents of that camp. And right now, the residents of that camp, under a UN whoa, help me with that word, protectorate, who are not being protected at all, are in the old American camp, Camp Liberty, there in Baghdad, where they're under constant siege by Iraqi security forces and by Iranians when they can. We have betrayed these people so bad. Interestingly enough, in 2002, they're the ones that first told the Americans about the Iranian nuclear program. And when the United Nations was encouraged to go inspect, they went to inspect the Iranian nuclear program, and they started to go to this series of buildings, and somebody sent them a flash message and said, that's the wrong building. You got to go to that building 200 meters down to the right. And they went in, and certainly that's where they found part of the Iranian nuclear program. So the MEK also provided American forces endless streams of good intelligence inside Iraq. And despite that, we have kicked them to the dirt, kicked them. And the problem is that's kind of the way American policy goes a little bit too often, unfortunately. They're off the terror watch list. They're still being, MEK people are still being killed in Camp Liberty. And we should hope a lot of those people would have the ability to come to the United States at some point because of their undying loyalty to the United States, despite all the things we've done to them. Now, I'm going to move over to Iraq now with a little bit more detail. Iraq is kind of a woulda, coulda, shoulda thing, and I'm talking about Iran here because isn't it so interesting? It is to me. I was asked today on a radio show this morning, what about our going to Iraq in the first place? And I said, we can always argue about should we have gone to Iraq or not. Frankly, I don't, I'm still suspect about weapons of mass destruction. I have no belief whatsoever that there are any ties between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. The arguments can go on and on about whether they were a threat to us. But here's the interesting thing. This is the argument nobody can deny. In 2003, when we went into Iraq to defeat Saddam Hussein, our number one enemy in the Middle East was Iran. It was Iran. It was then, and it is now. And the only thing that's happened in the interim years, $2 trillion, 4,600 American men and women, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died. Iran has come out all the stronger for it, and we've come out the loser, and that's not even talking about what's going on right now. Yeah. The fact of the matter is, U.S. foreign policy, our national policy of going to war in Iraq could not have been more disastrous. We were clearly not the winners in that. And those problems we had in Iraq go back to leadership. Some of you maybe heard me say something, I think, at the Tea Party convention earlier this year. I think I got to take a shot at Condoleezza Rice. I always like to when I can. Fox lets me do it on TV. There's people who really wanted her to be the President of the United States, and my argument always is, why was she qualified to be the National Security Advisor? Show me, I've said this on television, show me one thing in her resume that qualified her to be the National Security Advisor, who incidentally was the National Security Advisor, who took us to war and cost us all that money. There's nothing on her resume. Remember, she came in to be the National Security Advisor because she knew a lot about Russia. And incidentally, when she left, our relationship with Russia was worse than it had been in years. And Donald Rumsfeld came in to be the Secretary of Defense because he was known for ballistic missile defense expertise. Because when the Bush administration came in, the issue was ballistic missile defense. And it suddenly became something else. Rumsfeld, I have a lot of respect for. I've met with him a number of times. Condoleezza Rice, and he made a lot of mistakes. I can't say the same for Condoleezza Rice. So then we send the worst choice in the world over there to lead our efforts in Iraq, Jerry Bremer. Jerry L. Bremer. I knew him in the days when I was running clandestine ops while I was still in the service, still in the military. We had to go down and coordinate clandestine activities overseas with Jerry Bremer in the State Department. We always got the same answer from him: no. We'd get an urgent flash message from an embassy somewhere that they were having problems, they were about to be overrun, something was going on, asking for our help. Go down to the State Department. No. Well, Mr. Bremer, what do we need to do? Have the Secretary of Defense call the Secretary of State to get this sorted out? Oh, okay, all right, we'll let you do it. I mean, those are the kinds of tactics we have to use. So we take this guy, L. Paul Bremer, and make him the Viceroy in Iraq. And the first thing he did was disband the Iraqi army. Many of you have heard this before. I mean, this is just a cascading downhill about all the problems. He disbands the Iraqi army. Now, let me tell you, some of you should know this, that the U.S. military, before we ever went into Iraq, has struck a deal with the Iraqi army. Not with the Revolutionary Guards, who were hardcore, but with the rest of the army. You guys put down your weapons and don't fight, and we'll leave you in place. We'll pay you. We'll have a job when the country is taken over by us, and we'll work out everything at the other end. So they expected that. That was a promise we had made to them. And L. Paul Bremer went in and disbanded the Iraqi army. And there's been plenty of comment and criticism about that. That started the cascading effect of the insurgencies in Anbar. I still remember being called down to Fox the first day, 82nd Airborne. My son was in the 82nd, not deployed over there at the time. Our first big confrontation between the U.S. military and former Iraqi army guys, we killed 17 of them. They were protesting because they wanted to get paid. The 82nd opened up out in Fallujah and killed 17 of them. And from that point on, it really went downhill. Really went downhill fast. So then L. Paul Bremer said, anybody who was a member of the Ba'ath Party can't participate in anything that we're doing in Reconstruction. Well, to his credit, David Petraeus, who I met in September, we invaded March of '03. I met him in September up in Mosul, ironically in Mosul. He told us, myself and some other guys, he said, frankly, I'm under strict order not to let any Ba'athists do anything for us, but I can't do anything without the Ba'athists. People joined the Ba'ath Party if they wanted to have a job, if they wanted to be a teacher, if they wanted to work in a bank, if they wanted to be a civil engineer. You had to join the Ba'ath Party. Didn't mean you believed in it, but you had to join it. But Bremer's flat policy was no Ba'athists. So now we alienated a bunch of other people that had something to contribute. And it continued to go downhill. Then Donald Rumsfeld refused to admit that there was an insurgency going on. Anybody remember the words dead enders? These are a bunch of dead enders. They weren't dead enders. This was an insurgency building up, and we weren't developing a strategy yet to deal with it. Ironically, and I think Ron said I spent 3.5 years in Vietnam, a good part of that advising Vietnamese in special ops, special activities. We ended up in Iraq actually embracing almost every program we had, non-conventional program we had in Vietnam. Almost every one, because they worked in Vietnam. We may have lost the war in the halls of Congress, but on the ground we were actually doing pretty good by the time we were pulling out. So every major program we had that dealt with police, reconstruction, training and advising the military, all those things ended up being put in place and used in Iraq. Although at the early days, if you said anything about Vietnam anywhere in Washington, D.C., or on the news, or in the halls of Congress, you were loudly and quickly bombarded, told to shut up. They didn't want anybody to think Iraq might look like Vietnam. In fact, it ended up looking like Vietnam, and it was fairly successful for the most part. So now again, without jumping around too much, and it's difficult to keep, I'm going to come back to Iraq, obviously, for everything that's going on right now, but let me wander off and say, Iraq is a tragedy. It's a tragedy of unbelievable proportions, particularly when you think about all the people who supported us, all the Iraqis who believed in us, all the Iraqis who really put their heart and soul supporting America, supporting America's interests, trying to make Iraq work. Maliki, who some of you may have heard the news tonight, Maliki still refuses to leave. The Prime Minister still refuses. You know who put him into office? The Bush administration in 2006. We had two candidates to be the Prime Minister of Iraq. We had Maliki and Alawi, a guy named Alawi. Alawi was a pretty moderate guy, well respected. But Maliki knows the Iranians really well. So if we put Maliki as Prime Minister, he can make our relationship with Iran much better. He can convince the Iranians to quit participating inside Iraq. And that's the mindset that gave us Maliki, who now to this day as of today, refuses to step down. These are the kinds of decisions that drive us to places that we don't want to be in. So I'm going to, again, moving around a little bit, and I'll come back to Iraq. I'll talk a little bit about the Arab Spring. I'm going to leave some countries out, but I always like to remember that, for one thing, in the Bush era, in Iran, they had the Orange Revolution. They had all these people, all these students who wanted to speak out against the mullahs, who wanted to run candidates against the mullahs, who really wanted the mullahs ousted. And they had a very active social media campaign that was very effective. Now, those people who were particularly effective disappeared off the streets. But nonetheless, there was an absolute opportunity, and they were reaching out to the United States. Please, can you help us? Can you do something? Did we say one word? Not one damn word out of Washington, D.C. in support of those students. Well, not just students, but older people. Not one word. Did we send them any money clandestinely or covertly to support their activities, to empower them a little bit? Not one stinking penny. And at the end of the day, they were crushed. A lot of them executed, a lot of them still in jail today, and there was another missed opportunity. I mean, it's very difficult to go back and look at Iran since 1979 and understand why we have failed in every aspect to do something over there. And frankly, I always tend to think it's the State Department that causes those kinds of things. Lebanon, the Cedars Revolution. People taken to the streets after the war between Hezbollah and Israel. 2007, I was on TV almost every night during that war. After that war, Hezbollah was empowered. And Hezbollah made a power play in Lebanon. And into the streets went students and Christians and Sunnis, everybody who would want on our side. They went to the streets to protest against Hezbollah. Did we do anything at all to help them? Anything? I mean, even the slightest little thing? No. And Hezbollah suddenly became a very powerful political faction inside Lebanon, and they are today. Key posts in the central government, representation in the legislature. They used to be nothing more than a terrorist organization. When I started dealing with them, against them, they weren't even known as Hezbollah then. They didn't have the Hezbollah name. They got that in the mid-'80s. I was dealing against them in the early '80s. And now they're a force to be reckoned with. Not only as Israel looks to the north and worries about fighting them, but as politics make their way in Lebanon. And how about Hamas? Hamas, look at that, Hamas. You know what? We had an opportunity. Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. Palestinian Authority really used to have purview over all of the Palestinians. It was the PLO for the most part. Were they our friends? No. But they weren't as radical as Hamas. So when the Israelis pulled out of Gaza and elections were carried out, basically there were two parties running. There was the Palestinian Authority and there was Hamas. Did the United States government stand up and help the Palestinian Authority, who we had a good dialogue with, a good working relationship with? Did we help them one little bit against Hamas? No. And Hamas used terror tactics, intimidation, people disappearing off the streets, people being killed. They used every dirty trick that there was. And they won the election. And now they're the governing authority inside Gaza. This administration, the previous administration, once again, just totally turned a blind eye. It was like it wasn't there. And these are policy decisions being made by people. It's so difficult to understand where we have people that make these kinds of decisions. For the most part, they're people that have no real experience overseas. They live in Washington, D.C. most of their lives. We'll talk just a little bit about Egypt. I was in Egypt last year. with a small group and had a chance to meet with General Sisi, who's now the president. Very interesting. We met with them. We met with the Pope of the Coptic Church. We met with the students who actually had started the social media campaign that kicked Mubarak out, and then later came back to kick Morsi out. Same people that kicked Mubarak out came back and kicked Morsi out. Through social media campaign, activism in the streets. And let me tell you some of the numbers, just to give you an example. Now, first off, this administration still wants a return to what they call democracy. They still want Morsi. They still believe Morsi should be the legitimately elected president. But let me recap some of the numbers for you. First off, Mubarak is a guy who helped keep the peace in the Middle East forever with Israel. He did our bidding. Anything we asked him to do, anything we asked Mubarak to do, he did. He did for us. And this administration, was he the nicest guy in the world? Probably not. But was he somebody we could rely on, particularly when it comes to peace? Yeah, he was. This administration kicked him to the ground. You can still see it in his face when you see he can't believe how he was treated and what happened. So here's what happened. The social media campaign, protests, demonstrations, the Arab Spring, this administration criticizing him and saying it's time for you to go, it's time for you to listen to the will of the people. The people were out on the streets. Mubarak left. Mubarak went, arrested, thrown in jail. And Morsi, they didn't have an election, and Morsi gets elected president of Egypt. There were 52 million people who could have voted. About 26 million people did. And of the 26 million, 13.2 million voted for Morsi. Was that an overwhelming mandate? Not quite, but he won. And within a very short period of time, the electorate began to realize this guy was not who they thought he was going to be. And he was marching right down the Muslim Brotherhood mantra.